I'll tell you a little bit about what I thought after reading your great book, David. Two things really stuck with me. One is that I've been covering these issues for, the better part of 20 years. I had no idea it was this bad. The scope and the scale and the way that you take the reader through the history and the ideological foundation, and then the organization, and then the expansion of Chinese Communist Party driven espionage, and then the way that they mobilized the entire system, really their entire society, toward their joining their espionage industry with their industrial policy was way worse than I was aware. And it really reaches everything. And it seems to me, we have an expert group here, but so everybody in this room sort of in 2026 understands that this is a problem. And we can see that our industry and our technology and our media and our business interactions and our finance and our telecoms and our agriculture are all connected on the Chinese side of the equation. But not all of us know how we got here. So this is really, to my mind, a seminal work to lay down the record, so that here, now that we're kind of, I would say, most of us can agree that this is a problem that we need to tackle, we have an actual definitive account of how we got here and what we're dealing with. So I think that's really a contribution to the discussion that I've never really seen done so well before. So thank you for that. And the second thing I really liked about your book, and I'm not being paid to be here, so this is my honest opinion, is that it's accessible. So, for experts, you can learn something new, but really anybody. I always use the test of my parents. My parents are like, they're smart, but they're not in Washington. They don't follow this stuff like we do. I would give this to them. They could pick it up tomorrow and not put it down. It moves quick. It speaks in plain language, and it uses real examples, real stories, actual information. It doesn't talk in generalities. It gives you hard cases and takes you through them in a way that I think can hopefully take this conversation that we've been having in rooms like these and really spread it all to everyone in our society who needs to know about it, so we can have an honest and open and nationwide discussion about what to do. And all of the choices and all of the options that you present are complicated, and they all have trade-offs, and they all place different American values opposed to each other. We want an open society. We want a collaborative society. We want a free market society. At the same time, we have to protect ourselves. And that is essentially what I got from your book. Tell me if I'm wrong, that the Chinese Communist Party has figured out a way to exploit that contradiction, that we want to have a international and robust and engagement with everyone, including the Chinese in many respects. Yet they're weaponizing those relationships against us on a variety of fronts. And so I encourage you all to buy one and read one, but for right now, what I'd like to do is to take our audience here, people watching at home, into a couple of those stories, a couple of those examples, and that really, I think, illustrate what we're dealing with. And I want to start with the one that you started with in the book. It's a very specific and a very shocking case involving a businessman who some of you might have heard of by the name of Elon Musk. And tell us, first of all, why you chose that story. I mean, then you went back and you started with the history and the Sun Tzu and the Xi Jinping, but first you started with the Elon Musk. So tell us what that story is in your own words, and what happened, and why you chose that to start your book. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Clark Institute, for hosting us, Josh, for moderating or being a participant in the conversation as you've laid out sort of the objectives of the book in very clear terms, in terms of the impact for you. So thank you for that. Let me start a little bit before the Elon Musk story in Tesla, Shanghai 2018, 2019. For context, that's going to be the story. The story for me begins as someone asked me as we were having the refreshments, what drove me to write the book? And I said, there's a personal reason, and then there's a macro reason. And Elon Musk and Tesla will be illustrative of this in terms of why to sort of get the hook of the reader into the book before telling the history, and then really going through the labyrinth of the Ministry of State Security and all that, which we'll get into as well. The personal reason for writing it is that 22.5 million of my closest friends in the intelligence community, past and present at the time in May of 2015, had their security dossiers stolen. It was through the OPM, the Office of Personnel and Management system, that failed us, failed me, failed these good Americans who had been working for the government in the past, or at that time in the present, as was my case because I was still as the acting director, or at that time just ending my time as the acting director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. And it was a wake-up moment for me that something bigger than what I had experienced during the Soviet era in the Cold War, 1982, when I joined CIA straight out of Georgetown University, was all of a sudden very personal. Imagine your polygraph results, everything that you have shared in confidence for your security dossier, all my family members and friendships and relationships that were on this infamous form, the SF-86, that is filled out by everyone for security clearance, was gone. I often said after the fact, if I were running a division or running a directorate, the Directorate of Operations at CIA, I would have created my own division just for the exploitation of this precious data that was acquired. So it was really personal, and that was a motivator for the book. The larger one, and you've really done it in the introduction, and Josh, you've accentuated it in your comments, was I started seeing a pattern of behavior, particularly under Xi Jinping, that if you took the 1.3 to 1.7 trillion dollar GDP of China when they joined the World Trade Organization in December of 2001, and by the way, it was bipartisan. This isn't about one side or the other. It was supported by the Clinton administration through the 90s to get them there. Formal general agreement on tariffs and trade became the WTO. And the whole idea was to get China to join it. And then in the George W. Bush White House, because of it being 3 months after 9/11, it certainly had the support of the Republican side with this erroneous expectation that they would play by the rules. And by playing by the rules of the international order in trade and finance and so forth, and most favored nation restrictions being lifted in terms of that, they would behave themselves, and in fact it would moderate their behavior from all the piracy stuff that any of us that were in China in the 1980s and 90s saw out on the sidewalks and everything, in terms of everything from your fake Rolexes to fancy jeans and all the rest. Well, it could not have been more wrong. And then on top of that, it would lead to the expectation, that is, of really modifying, moving China toward democratic objectives, and that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, would change its behavior. And again, we've seen that under Xi Jinping since 2013 to be very erroneous in terms of that expectation. So those two things combined. So now I get to the Elon Musk story. Elon Musk cut a deal with the Chinese Communist Party at the highest levels in Shanghai to come in and do an investment for Tesla and the production of Tesla in Shanghai, with a factory where the groundbreaking would be in 2019, with anybody with any business experience would say this is a great deal. Sole ownership in China. Joint venture not need apply, 49%, 51% Chinese, 49% the foreign investor and manufacturer that's coming into China, Western, from any country. So he represented 0.01% of those who could do a sole ownership. He's feeling pretty good about it. Meanwhile, Mr. Cao is hard at work putting thumb drives in and downloading the driverless autopilot portion.
Mr. Cow is, just for the
Mr. Cao is an employee of Tesla back home in the United States. he puts in the thumb drive. This is all, of course, discovered after the fact, I might add. Obviously, they would have stopped it if they'd known it. And so the story goes, and the hook in the book in terms of this is that while Elon Musk is sitting there inking these deals for Tesla and the groundbreaking in Shanghai for a production line that would meet its target of cars coming off the production line in 1 year. So it was an absolute golden opportunity to sell Tesla to 1.4 billion people in terms of the market that it represented. Obviously, not all buying Teslas, but of course a very handsome reward in terms of the investment. Meanwhile, Mr. Kao is back home downloading the autopilot version of it, which is today in BYD the number one EV selling car in the world by orders of magnitude now. What was Mr. Musk's response to this? One, I don't really care. I'll always stay ahead of them. I'm better than anything that competes against me. Now, to suggest through the interviews of the individuals who were associated with the security team at Tesla that it didn't upset him would be a misnomer. Obviously, no one likes their pickpocket while they're inking a deal almost simultaneously. And so that's really the story of somewhere between the hubris and the expectation of returns on investment at the same time that the Chinese willfully, as you pointed out in terms of the technology advancements that they seek to accomplish or obtain, was in fact downloading this capability in terms of just the autopilot piece of it in terms of that. But that's essentially the story.
Yeah, it's an amazing example, I think, for two reasons. One, which you just highlighted, which is this false assumption that selling out your technology for access to the Chinese market in the short term is okay because they can't innovate, and we see now that they can, and they can scale, and they can manufacture, and so the technology theft is not the end of the story, and that is something I think that Elon Musk learned the hard way. And it's interesting to me that when I cover the Trump administration's second term technology debates, Elon is actually on the China hawk side of the debates more often than not, which surprises people, and against people like David Sachs, because essentially he learned the hard way. He figured out that giving China our technology or letting them steal it either way, not a good idea for our long-term competitiveness.
And Josh, I would like to underscore one other thing, is that what the book identifies to what looks to be sort of a chaotic Chinese effort to what us in the intelligence community would have said requirements for collection is actually quite well structured under the Made in China 2025, which now has been extended by Xi Jinping for another 5 years to 2030. So all of a sudden, the EV market falls into one of their 10 areas of prioritized technologies and innovation plan, Made in China 2025's plan, in a way to deliver this. And I think I have not spoken to Elon Musk and would never suggest that I am reflecting what he's thinking to your last comment. But maybe there's been an awakening that perhaps he had as part of this larger strategic plan that China has undertaken.
I think that's a very strong possibility, actually, and that's what I hear from people who interact with him. And the second big lesson I think that came out of that story that you expand on later in the book is that we think of espionage these days as satellites, cyber warfare, etc., like a lot of tech. But what you describe is, since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, a huge expansion of the Ministry of State Security's human intelligence networks and their consideration of overseas Chinese all over the world in all fields as potential collectors, either wittingly or unwittingly. 1,000 grains of sand, that's the term that you use, right? And this, of course, is a very sensitive issue because I remember in the first Trump administration, people were very, in academia and in scientific organizations, rightfully concerned about the targeting of ethnically Chinese and Chinese American people. At the same time, the NMSS is definitely targeting ethnically Chinese and Chinese American people in all of these industries. So talk about that, and talk about it when you were writing the book, but also when you were in a position to be in charge of a lot of these issues, how you view the MSS's actions, especially on American soil, with Americans, and how bad is it, and what do you think is the right balance between understanding it and also not crossing that line into becoming the thing that we don't want to become, which is a country that profiles people.
Well, you said it well in terms of your observations of the challenges that intelligence poses in an open and free society like our own versus obviously the kind of authoritarianism that we see in China and the spying that occurs on their own population inside there. And it's no secret in terms of profiling is an absolute regular aspect of Chinese life in the mainland. A few words about, or a few descriptions which are elaborated in the book on what is essentially the labyrinth of the Ministry of State Security. Just to give you somewhat of a perspective on it, the Ministry of State Security is both their foreign and domestic services. So think of CIA, think of the FBI, all combined under one roof, if you will, along with their national security agency equivalent in terms of signals intelligence and cyber command and cyber capabilities. So think about the enormity of the power under this Ministry of State Security. And on top of that, has become, in a sense, a go-to for Xi Jinping. He is, I'll insert the word enamored. He is someone who trusts and uses the MSS as his apparatus for both the domestic spying and regional bureaus through the provincial level, and then at the same time externally. The MSS Department 18 is at the crux of the operational both planning and execution against the United States. Out of 18 departments, it happens to be the final one, the 18th department. It has, from our research and our understanding, an infinite amount of resources to do it. And to just give you an idea, the entire MSS, when Xi came to power, was estimated to be at about 150,000 in terms of employees. The unclassified number for the U.S. entire intelligence community hovers around 90 to 100,000, maybe post-Doge, it's a little bit smaller, but certainly in that realm. So by the time 2017, 2018 roll along, and Made in China 2025 kicked off in 2015 as a 10-year plan, had already doubled in size to 300,000. And the Department 18 was put on steroids in terms of this. Out of that, you may have heard of Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, these huge cyber attack mechanism of getting into our telecommunication system, not only here, but estimated to be in 80 countries of where Salt Typhoon has gotten into telecommunication, is run out of the MSS. Sort of taking a back seat is the People's Liberation Army intelligence aspect, their version of a DIA inside the PLO to the MSS. The strong entity for espionage now in this whole of society that you reference is then enabled by the Intelligence Security Act of 2017, in which Article 7 is a curious but fascinating article. If you read constitutional law, maybe it puts you to sleep. I find it fascinating. This law passes in Article 7 is language that every Chinese citizen must support the CCP's objectives, not shall, could, perhaps, maybe, shall. It's declarative, and every Chinese business entity must support when called upon. Does that mean all 280,000 estimated students, at least that's the latest number I have in the United States, that are Chinese students, are spies today? No, I'm not suggesting that, and it's certainly not profiling for that. I will say there is a better than even chance that they will be tapped if they're in STEM programs, advanced degrees in academia, in the areas of the sciences and technologies and telecommunications and that sort of thing. Why? Because we know that's in their plan of collection. So it's almost circular. You know what they need and what they're going after, and so that's the MSS in broad strokes, and it is the leading apparatus for the industrial level at scale espionage that we'll see.
Interesting. So liberal arts degrees, no problem. Let the Chinese students study English literature.
Generally,
but
if
AI,
they want to study
machine
Shakespeare,
learning.
please let them have it and go at it.
Got it. So we have to figure out what to protect and what not to protect. You mentioned Salt Typhoon. I want to come back to that in a second. But before I do, I want to ask you about this sort of conundrum that I ran into while reading your book over and over again. Because there's so many different industries. There's a chapter on the agriculture industry, telecom, Silicon Valley. The one that really messed with my head the most was the Wall Street one. American investment, American private equity firms, American banks intentionally funding the companies, including the most problematic companies that are building the machine that's pointed at us over and over. You've got so many examples. Sequoia was pretty shocking, the stuff that was in there about. I mean, I knew some of it, but not all of it. How do we deal with that? How as a government, as a country, as a society, do we deal with our leading finance institutions and investment institutions wantonly, blatantly, consistently, over years and years, dumping billions of dollars to build the intelligence machine for our adversary that is pointed at us and is stealing all of our companies' intellectual property and using it to scale and defeat our own economy. Both of those things are happening at the exact same time. What's the solution? How do we get our heads around that? What policy would address that?
So let me parse your question into two parts: the offshoring of U.S. investment in China and the onshoring of Chinese Shenzhen capital and others into the United States. They're a single coin, but two sides of
outbound investment and inbound.
Outbound and inbound. On the outbound, clearly there is a, should I be so crass as to say greed associated with it. The expected return on investment has been oftentimes very good. You mentioned Sequoia. Sequoia went so far as to establish Sequoia China. I mean, this was not hidden in terms of investments in it. The naivete, the hubris, whatever the motivations associated with supporting the PLA's, the People's Liberation Army's modernization, and by the PLA I also mean Air Force, Navy, and all aspects, space related to it, is often undertaken through shell companies on the Chinese side that require enormous due diligence that I draw, Josh, it's a little bit having served 5 years in Mexico and looked at how cartels move the money, and I'm fascinated by the way money moves in terms of money laundering and all that sort of thing. And in many ways, the Chinese have taken that to a level that is very difficult to identify that in fact that investment is going for the PLA modernization. There isn't a shingle that hangs out there. Please contribute as an investor to the hypersonics program of China. But there will be cutout after cutouts associated with that. In many ways, now getting to the solution to the outbound funds is the Wall Street and the investors, and I'll name one like BlackRock, is one, or Sequoia, should run the diligence and should be required to run the diligence around it, much like you would do if you were investing where there are money laundering concerns as a financial institution, in terms of that, in terms of my past association with HSBC and the morass of the Mexico case of being determined as a money laundering concern in 2012. you do that sort of due diligence. And in the financial sector, of course, that's known as your second line of defense, and how you work the compliance aspects of it. And I think regulatory-wise, you need to do a lot more with the outbound investment. Clearly, the Uyghur issue or child labor laws, and that hasn't been enough of a deterrent in terms of what we know occurs in China in terms of what you would think might be a dissuasion from investing. Inbound, again, the challenge is they have come into Silicon Valley with small levels of investment. The book gives examples of that, where a startup in venture capital, not even reaching yet the private equity level at venture capital, will put in $1 million. Doesn't sound like a big deal. Well, it's interesting. They have a foothold now. If that venture capital goes on to develop something for our industrial base, for the defense side or the intelligence community, and that sort of thing. Why? Because they won't even ask for a board seat. They're okay with just $1 million. They let it go, and they have bake-offs in venture capital in where they who can do the best thing on widget X, and then they pursue to underwrite it in these small amounts. You would say that's a sleeper. Now, for the guy or the gal that's sitting in the garage, $1 million is $1 million. It looks very attractive. It's hard to turn down, but they do this over and over and over again. And so, to me, there has to be a regulatory construct around the origin of money that's inbound as well. And so it really is two parts. And I took great care in the chapter that really addresses the finance piece, because in the end, that's really what drives a lot of what we see. Yes, there's IP theft, and that's clearly, as former director of FBI Chris Wray said, upwards of $600 billion a year in terms of intellectual property taken in terms of just the U.S., and that's probably low because a lot goes unreported. So it's very significant. So I'm not suggesting that there's a sort of a trade-off between the two things. But in the investment arena, I think those are the two things that you really have to parse and really spend some time on.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. In covering these issues, I find that there's two ways to get the companies to play ball: to incentivize them or to regulate them, penalize them,
if necessary.
And from what I'm hearing from you, we should do a bit of both. Got it. Let me ask you about the telecommunications piece, because you brought up Salt Typhoon. I'm sure people in this room are aware, but just in case you're not, every major U.S. telecom company's infrastructure completely penetrated by MSS cyber spies for at least 18 months, probably longer, 2 years. It became public last year. I wrote about this about a year ago, and it's still ongoing. Every single cell phone in this room is accessible. They recorded and listened in on the phone calls of President Trump, Vice President Vance, senior White House officials at the time in the Biden-Harris administration, God knows who else, and
congressional staff.
They broke into the classified FBI source case system, compromised it completely. And
it's very important to underscore.
Yeah.
That's your Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act system.
Right, the FISA court system.
With the FISA court on criminals when it goes to the court for approval. Imagine having that data.
So all of their surveillance on the Chinese spies.
So they would know on the Chinese spies.
Right, so possibly compromise our entire source network. And there's no fix. There is nobody who can claim that we can say it's been fixed. They just don't know. So that seems pretty bad. Where are we now with Salt Typhoon? What could be done? What should be done? If you were still in charge of an intelligence agency, what would you call on to do? Because it seems like it's been 2 years, and it doesn't seem like anyone's really got any idea how to fix it. It seems pretty bad.
Well, just so you know, the nomenclature typhoon comes from. So you're not hearing a secret code word when you hear typhoon. That's what they named it because that's where it was first identified, as Josh says, at least 18 months, 2 years ago. Volt typhoon, which we'll get into perhaps on the whole issue of getting into our infrastructure, our water supply, electric grid, and that sort of thing, is maybe goes back as far back as 2020. Salt typhoon has been identified already in about 80 countries. And the various others in the cybersecurity domain believe there's as many as 7 other campaigns going on in cyber as it pertains to attacks by very targeted attacks by the Chinese. So their sophistication far exceeds maybe a little bit of the Elon Musk hubris nationally, where we say, oh, it's not possible. How could they get into Verizon, AT&T, and all the rest of them in this way? The fact is they have. You ask, what would I do as an intelligence leader in terms of looking at this? We need a whole of government, private sector approach to this. This is how dire the situation is.
What does that mean exactly? I hear that a lot. We need more.
Yeah.
Break it down into more specifics.
Sure. Let me bite-sized pieces. What we need is the government needs to rely on the private sector in order to better understand the nature of the threats, the intelligence sharing that must go on between the NSA, cyber-related, less the SIGINT, the signals intelligence, the traditional SIGINT piece of NSA. This is the cyber component of it, along with Cyber Command. We need to find a way to share it with the private sector and vice versa, have the private sector come into a very open, perhaps at a classified level, discussion about what to do about it. This is a national emergency as far as I'm concerned.
That hasn't happened yet?
That hasn't happened in a coherent, unified way. I think pieces of it, I talked to some of the TCOM people for the book, and they say some of it's happening, but it's underinvested in terms of the Trump administration putting the resources against it and the focus of it, frankly, in how serious it is. And tomorrow, when I'm up with Representative Molinar, who was the successor in terms of the select committee on this, is that I, with Mike Gallagher before him,
the select committee on the Chinese Communist Party.
Chinese Communist Party in this is one of the areas. I said, if there were one thing that you could do to really bring together the White House alongside of the legislative branch and the judicial branch, it would be in this arena. It's that serious.
Well, I'm told that if you use iMessage, it's protected because actually Apple didn't provide the government a backdoor to its system. Is that right?
Correct.
All right, interesting. So for all of you out there,
you might not trust WhatsApp, though.
Yeah, can't not what, but Signal, is Signal okay? Maybe.
What
do we need? I mean, assuming you don't include a journalist in your Signal chat,
right? Well,
accidentally.
Yeah, exactly. From the Atlanta.
But if you are going to include me,
you want to make sure that you're reading it. Yeah.
All right.
Look, there's 2 aspects of it. Signal is, from all I understand from it, is secure in its transmission. The problem is data at rest. They're already in that device that you have in your pocket, and I see no one's looking at them right now. But if they are in that, they're reading it because it's already gone to clear. So that's the problem with any one of the systems.
Got it. Last question.
I would not do war plans, for example,
on Signal. Right.
You just wouldn't be smart to do.
Right. That's good advice in case anyone's watching.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question, then I'm going to turn it over to the audience. One of the things, again, that I sort of knew but learned a lot more about after reading your book was in many of these critical technology areas, the Chinese are no longer stealing from us. They've surpassed us. Batteries, EVs, you could say, hypersonics.
Right. That one out.
So is turnabout fair play? Can we great heist them now? if there is that something that can I plant an idea into the intelligence community bloodstream? Or is that should we have a policy of espionage that takes advantage of that?
You ask a profound question.
Thank you.
In that, of course, the profound question has to do with the structure of our intelligence and the purpose of our intelligence. 33-ish years of doing the intelligence business directly or being associated in an advisory capacity to John Radcliffe and others in the past, is that our structure for espionage is really designed around a non-economic collection. Look, we just don't do it. It doesn't mean you never do it on something. And so much like the enormous pivot that took place after 9/11 with intelligence that went to a very tactical level because intelligence had to identify where the plotters were in the cell deep inside Syria or Afghanistan or wherever that might do us harm in support of the warfighter and all that. There was a huge change in the signals collection and all of that. We have not changed to collect on the economic counter-espionage to it. Also, I think here's where I come down to the recommendations in the 7 pillars. Around the crown jewels that both we want to protect and we want to understand where China stands. That would be AI, large language models that you mentioned, the technology around quantum and where that's headed, biotech and other chips in terms of what Huawei and ZTE are looking for in terms of the Chinese demands for it. In those areas, perhaps we need to do a pivot around that for the collection of that. Now, I'm the first to tell you I want it done with the kind of oversight that's required of intelligence by our House and Senate select committees to do it. Why? Because the challenge is, and the counter argument for collecting on economic matters has often been, and then what do you do with it for the United States? Do you give it to Boeing, but not to fill in the blank, to Lockheed? Do you give it to Lockheed because they're building the next version of the F-35 perhaps, or whatever it is, and Northrop Grumman? We have not done that. The French model applies there. That's what they do. That would not be the case. We have not done economic espionage by and large. Should we? I think with guardrails done properly and really focused on what it is, both what we want to protect and what we need to understand where our adversary stands, I think there's room for at least a conversation about that in sort of that tension between an open society and intelligence collection requirements around what you've described.
Fascinating, interesting. There's so many other things that I could get to, but I want to give this audience a chance to weigh in. So we're going to go off the record now.